Morrison Industries. Daniel Carter stepped out, his worn messenger bag slung over his shoulder, the strap frayed at the edges. He'd been summoned here an hour ago by a phone call that had interrupted his daughter's breakfast. The voice on the other end had been polite but firm, leaving no room for questions. Just an address, a time, and a name: Victoria Morrison. He didn't belong here. That much was clear from the moment his scuffed work boots touched the polished marble floor. Everything around him screamed wealth and power, from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city to the abstract art pieces that probably cost more than his annual salary. Daniel had spent the last 3 years working double shifts as a warehouse supervisor, barely keeping his head above water after his wife passed away. Every penny went toward his daughter Emma's care, her school supplies, the modest apartment they called home. There was nothing left for luxuries like new shoes or pride. A receptionist with perfect posture guided him down a corridor lined with photographs of corporate achievements, awards, handshakes with politicians, ribbon-cutting ceremonies. At the end of the hall, a set of double doors stood open, revealing an office that could have housed his entire apartment. Behind a desk of dark wood and clean lines sat Victoria Morrison herself. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with sharp features and dark hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her face. Her suit was immaculate, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, and her eyes held the kind of focus that made grown men stumble over their words in board meetings. She didn't stand when he entered, didn't smile, just gestured to the chair across from her with one manicured hand. Daniel sat, feeling the quality of the leather beneath him, wondering what emergency could possibly require his presence. He'd done work for Morrison Industries before, occasionally filling in when they needed extra hands in their distribution center, but he'd never been called to the executive suite, never even knew this floor existed. Victoria studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice crisp and professional. She had a problem, she explained, a significant one. Her late father's will contained a clause that surprised everyone, including her. To maintain her position as CEO and secure her full inheritance, she needed to be married within 6 months of his death. The board of directors, led by her ambitious younger brother Marcus, was already circling like sharks, ready to challenge her authority. They saw her as too young, too unmarried, too female to lead the company her father had built. Daniel listened, confused about why any of this concerned him. He was nobody, a single father barely scraping by, not someone who moved in circles where marriage clauses and corporate power struggles mattered. But Victoria wasn't finished. She'd done her research, she said, thoroughly. She needed someone who wouldn't ask questions, who needed money desperately enough to agree to unusual terms, and who had enough basic decency to be trustworthy. His background check had been extensive. His financial situation was dire. His daughter's medical bills from 2 years ago were still unpaid. His landlord had filed an eviction notice last month. She was offering him a contract, a marriage contract, 6 months of pretending to be her husband in exchange for $200,000. Enough to clear his debts, secure his daughter's future, and start over. The rules were simple: maintain appearances in public, attend events when required, and keep his mouth shut. No emotional involvement, no questions about her life or business. Just a transaction between two people who needed something from each other. Daniel felt his throat go dry. $200,000. The number echoed in his head like a prayer. It was more money than he'd see in 5 years of working himself to exhaustion. It was Emma's college fund. It was breathing room. It was survival. But it was also a lie, a deception that went against everything he tried to teach his daughter about honesty and integrity. His hands gripped the armrests of the chair, knuckles white. Before he could form a response, Victoria added one more condition. One unexpected rule that changed everything. He wouldn't just attend events with her. He would move into her penthouse, live there with his daughter. They would function as a family unit in front of everyone who mattered, from her board members to her household staff to the media that followed her every move. It had to be convincing, she explained. Half measures wouldn't satisfy the vultures waiting for her to fail. If they were going to do this, They had to commit completely to the illusion. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Living with her? Uprooting Emma from the only home she'd known, even if that home was a cramped apartment with thin walls and unreliable heating? Pretending to be a family when they were strangers bound by paperwork and desperation? But then he thought of the eviction notice. The debt collectors who called every evening. The way Emma pretended not to notice when he skipped meals so she could have seconds. The fear that lived in his chest every day. The terror that he was failing the one person who depended on him completely. He heard himself agree. The word came out rough, barely more than a whisper, but Victoria nodded as though she'd expected nothing less. She slid a thick contract across the desk. He should read it, she said, though her tone suggested she knew he'd already made his decision. He picked it up, the pages heavy with legal language he only half understood. There were clauses about confidentiality, public behavior, termination conditions. Everything was spelled out in black and white, reducing what should have been the most intimate relationship in someone's life to terms and conditions. "What made you choose me?" Daniel asked, finally finding his voice. There had to be hundreds of men who'd take this offer. Men with better credentials, more polish, fewer complications. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Maybe calculation, maybe respect. She told him she needed someone real. Someone who wouldn't try to leverage their position for more power or money later. Someone who understood what it meant to be desperate, to fight for something bigger than yourself. His background check hadn't just shown his debts. It had shown his work ethic, his clean record, the teachers who spoke highly of how he showed up to every parent conference despite working nights. She needed someone who could be trusted with a secret this big, and trust wasn't something money could buy. Daniel signed the contract that afternoon. Within a week, he and Emma were moving into Victoria's penthouse, a sprawling space on the 42nd floor with more rooms than they could ever use. Emma was 7 years old, small for her age, with her mother's gentle eyes and a quiet way of observing the world. She'd accepted the explanation with the resilience of a child who'd already learned that life didn't always make sense. They were going to stay with Daddy's new friend for a while. It would be an adventure. She'd have her own room, bigger than their whole apartment, and Daddy would be around more because this friend was helping them out. The first few days were awkward. Daniel felt like an imposter, walking through rooms decorated by professionals, using appliances he had to Google to operate. Victoria maintained strict boundaries. She left for work before dawn and returned after dinner, spending her evenings in her home office behind closed doors. They barely spoke beyond logistical necessities. The housekeeper, an older woman named Margaret who'd worked for the Morrison family for decades, seemed skeptical of the entire arrangement but kept her opinions to herself. If this feels rushed or forced, share what's missing for you in the comments. I want to know what resonates and what doesn't. Emma adapted faster than Daniel expected. She explored the penthouse with cautious curiosity, always asking permission before touching anything. Victoria, to her credit, had prepared a room for Emma with care. Not the generic guest room Daniel had feared, but a space with bookshelves and a reading nook, a desk by the window, soft lighting that wasn't too harsh. Someone had paid attention to what a child might actually want, not just what looked good in a design magazine. The first real interaction between Victoria and Emma happened on a Thursday evening. Daniel was cooking dinner in the massive kitchen, something simple because he still felt uncomfortable using equipment that probably cost more than his car. Emma was doing homework at the dining table, struggling with a math problem. He heard Victoria's heels clicking across the marble floor, the sound of her briefcase being set down. Then her voice, quieter than he'd ever heard it, asking Emma what she was working on. Daniel watched from the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand. Emma explained the problem, her small voice uncertain. Victoria pulled out a chair and sat down, her severe posture softening slightly. She didn't take over, didn't solve it for Emma, just asked questions, guided her thinking, waited patiently while Emma worked through the logic. When Emma got the answer, Victoria nodded once, a small smile ghosting across her face before she caught herself and stood up. She headed toward her office, then paused. Dinner smelled good, she said without turning around. She'd eat with them tonight instead of working through the meal. It became a pattern, slow and tentative. Victoria started coming home slightly earlier, though she never admitted it was intentional. She'd sit with Emma for a few minutes while Daniel cooked, helping with homework or listening to stories about school. The conversations were stilted at first, both of them careful not to step over invisible lines. But Emma had a way of seeing past the walls people built. She asked simple questions that somehow cut through pretense. Why do you work so late? Do you like your job? What was your favorite subject in school? Victoria answered, brief and factual, but she answered. The first public appearance came 3 weeks into the arrangement. A charity gala, the kind of event where Morrison Industries needed to be represented and Victoria needed to be seen as stable, settled, married. Daniel wore a rented tuxedo that had been tailored to fit him perfectly, courtesy of Victoria's assistant. He felt like a fraud walking into the hotel ballroom, Emma safely at home with Margaret. The room glittered with wealth and influence, every surface reflecting light from crystal chandeliers. Victoria stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and transformed into someone he barely recognized. She smiled, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, introduced him as her husband with a warmth in her voice that sounded genuine even though he knew it was performance. He followed her lead, shaking hands, making small talk, playing the role of the supportive spouse who was content to stand slightly behind the powerhouse he'd married. It was exhausting, every moment requiring careful attention to body language and tone. But something strange happened as the evening wore on. He began to notice things about Victoria that didn't fit the Ice Queen persona she projected. The way she steered conversations away from people who looked uncomfortable. How she remembered details about staff members, asking after a security guard's sick mother or a waiter's upcoming exam. The careful way she positioned herself when speaking to shorter guests so they didn't have to crane their necks. Small acts of consideration that suggested someone who paid attention, who cared about impact even when no one was watching. On the drive home, they sat in the back of the hired car in silence. Victoria stared out the window at the city lights streaming past. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low so the driver wouldn't overhear. She was good at that, he said. The whole act. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Which part was the act? She asked, and he didn't have an answer. The second month brought new complications. Victoria's brother Marcus started appearing more frequently, always with an excuse. Dropping by for dinner, needing Victoria's signature on documents, bringing board members for impromptu meetings that happened to occur during family time. Daniel recognized it for what it was: testing, surveillance, looking for cracks in the facade. Marcus was younger than Victoria by 4 years, handsome in a polished way, with their father's charm and none of Victoria's restraint. He smiled often, but his eyes stayed cold, calculating. During one of these visits, Marcus made a point of engaging Daniel in conversation. Asked about his work history, his background, how he and Victoria had met. The questions were casual on the surface, but Daniel felt the weight behind them. Every answer was being evaluated, filed away, checked for inconsistencies. Victoria intervened smoothly, redirecting the conversation, but the message was clear. They were being watched. Any mistake would be weaponized. That night, after Marcus left, Victoria and Daniel sat in the living room for the first time since he'd moved in. She poured herself a glass of wine, something she rarely did, and stared at the dark windows overlooking the city. Her brother was going to be a problem, she said quietly. He'd been promised the CEO position before their father changed his mind. The marriage clause was their father's way of protecting her, of ensuring she had stability before taking on the full weight of the company. But Marcus saw it as betrayal. He wanted what he believed was rightfully his, and he had allies on the board who agreed. Daniel asked why her father had chosen her over Marcus. Victoria was silent for a long moment. Because she told him the truth, she finally said. About the company's finances, about Marcus's risky investments, about the need for steady leadership instead of aggressive expansion. Their father had valued honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. Especially when it was uncomfortable. Marcus had told him what he wanted to hear. She told him what he needed to know. And now she was paying the price for that honesty by having to prove herself every single day. He understood then, in a way he hadn't before. They weren't so different. Both fighting to protect something important. Both willing to compromise their principles because the alternative was losing everything. She'd built her entire identity around this company, poured everything into proving she could lead it. He'd built his around being a good father, around giving Emma a life that didn't feel like constant struggle. They were both drowning in different ways, and this arrangement was a lifeboat neither of them could afford to capsize. The shift happened gradually, so slowly that neither of them noticed until it had already occurred. Victoria started spending more time outside her office in the evenings. She'd sit with Emma while Daniel cleaned up after dinner, asking about books Emma was reading or school projects. She taught Emma basic chess strategies, patient in a way that surprised Daniel. Emma started calling her Victoria instead of Miss Morrison, and Victoria didn't correct her. One evening, Daniel found Victoria in Emma's room, helping her with a science project about ecosystems. They were building a terrarium together. Victoria's expensive blouse pushed up to her elbows as she handled soil and small plants. Emma was explaining the water cycle with the enthusiasm only a 7-year-old could muster, and Victoria was listening like it was the most important presentation she'd hear all week. When Emma asked if Victoria had ever built a terrarium as a kid, Victoria's expression clouded. She'd been too busy with tutors and test prep, she said. Her father had very specific expectations about how she should spend her time. Daniel realized then that Victoria's childhood had probably been as lonely as Emma's was in some ways. Different circumstances, different challenges, but the same underlying isolation. Emma had lost her mother. Victoria had lost her childhood to corporate preparation. Both of them had learned too young that life didn't always offer softness or safety. The touches started without either of them acknowledging it. Victoria's hand on his shoulder when she passed behind his chair at dinner. His hand at the small of her back when they entered a room together at public events. Little gestures that could be explained as part of the performance but lasted a moment longer than necessary. A contact that held. Conversations that happened late at night in the kitchen when neither of them could sleep, talking about nothing important while the city hummed below them. If you're feeling something shift in the story, hit the like button. Sometimes we need to mark the moments that matter. Daniel knew he was crossing a line he'd promised not to approach. This was supposed to be a transaction. A business arrangement with clear boundaries and an expiration date. But Emma was happier than he'd seen her in years. She had space to breathe, resources he couldn't provide, and someone other than her father paying attention to her world. And Victoria, beneath her armor of efficiency and control, was capable of gentleness. He saw it in how she moved around Emma, careful not to startle or overwhelm. How she remembered that Emma preferred her sandwiches cut diagonally. How she started keeping juice boxes in the fridge even though she never drank them. The 4th month brought a new level of scrutiny. A business magazine was doing a feature on Victoria, part of a series on young CEOs reshaping traditional industries. The journalist wanted family photos, interviews, a glimpse into the personal life of the notoriously private Victoria Morrison. It was exactly the kind of publicity she needed to cement her image as stable and established, but it also meant extended exposure. More chances for the truth to slip out. They spent an afternoon being photographed in the penthouse. The photographer positioned them carefully. Victoria and Daniel on the couch, Emma between them with a book. Everyone in the kitchen staging breakfast. Daniel found himself laughing genuinely at something Emma said, and the photographer captured it. Victoria looking at him, not the camera, with an expression he couldn't quite read. The images looked real because in some strange way they were. This wasn't their life, but it also wasn't entirely false. They had become something undefined, something that didn't fit neatly into the categories of real or fake. The interview was harder. The journalist asked about how they met, about balancing family and career, about what Victoria had learned from marriage. Victoria answered smoothly, weaving a story that had just enough truth to feel genuine. They'd met through work. He'd shown her what mattered beyond the boardroom. Emma had stolen her heart immediately. Everything was technically accurate even if the context was completely fabricated. Daniel stayed quiet mostly, playing the supportive husband who preferred to let his wife shine. But when the journalist asked him directly what made their relationship work, he found himself speaking from a place of unexpected honesty. She sees people, he said, not just their function or their utility, but who they actually are. She pays attention. It's rare. The journalist scribbled notes enthusiastically, not realizing she was documenting the moment Daniel admitted something to himself that he'd been avoiding. He was developing feelings for Victoria Morrison. Real feelings. Complicated, inconvenient feelings that had no place in their arrangement. That night, after Emma was asleep and the interview stress had faded, Daniel found Victoria on the balcony. She stood at the railing. The city spread out below her like a circuit board of light and motion. He joined her, keeping a respectful distance. The interview went well, he said. She nodded, not looking at him. Too well, maybe. Felt more real than it should have. She finally turned to face him, her expression guarded. They needed to be careful, she said. The line between performance and reality was getting blurry. He agreed, even as he wondered if they were talking about the same thing. Was she warning him to maintain boundaries? Or was she admitting that she felt it too? This pull toward something neither of them had planned for? The board meeting that changed everything happened in the 5th month. Daniel wasn't supposed to be there, but Victoria asked him to attend. Unusual, but not unprecedented for spouses to observe major corporate decisions. Marcus would be presenting a proposal for a merger that Victoria opposed, and she wanted someone in the room who wasn't evaluating her through the lens of corporate politics. Someone who was just there for her. The boardroom was exactly what Daniel expected. Long table, expensive chairs, portraits of past leaders staring down in judgment. Marcus presented his case with practiced charm. The merger would expand Morrison Industries' reach, create new revenue streams, position them for aggressive growth. It sounded good on the surface. But Victoria countered with data, with long-term projections, with evidence that the merger would compromise their core values and destabilize their workforce. It wasn't about growth at any cost. It was about sustainable leadership. The board was split. Older members sided with Victoria's caution. Younger members were swayed by Marcus's ambition. Then Marcus played his card. He questioned whether Victoria had the focus to lead effectively. Suggested that perhaps family obligations were distracting her from what the company needed. Implied that a CEO who'd married suddenly, who now had a child to consider, might not have the single-minded dedication the role required. It was a calculated attack, designed to make her defensive, to make her prove her commitment by choosing the company over family. But Victoria didn't take the bait. She stood, her voice clear and steady. Yes, she said. She had a family now, and that gave her perspective that Marcus lacked. Leadership wasn't about sacrificing everything on the altar of ambition. It was about building something sustainable, something that honored the people who made success possible. Their father had built this company with values, not just profit margins. She would honor that legacy by remembering that business was ultimately about people. Daniel watched the room shift, saw board members reconsider their positions. Victoria wasn't defending herself against the accusation of softness. She was reframing what strength looked like. The vote on the merger was postponed for further analysis, and Marcus left the room with barely contained fury. In the car afterward, Victoria was quiet. Daniel wanted to tell her she'd been brilliant, that she'd outmaneuvered Marcus without resorting to his tactics. But before he could speak, her phone rang. Marcus, demanding a private meeting. Victoria declined. He pushed, threatening to go public with questions about her marriage, about Daniel's background. And there it was, the threat they'd both been dreading. Marcus had been investigating, looking for ammunition, and he'd found enough to cause damage. They arrived back at the penthouse to find Marcus waiting in the lobby. Building security had let him up because he was family. He followed them into the elevator, his presence filling the small space with tension. When they reached the penthouse, Victoria dismissed Margaret and turned to face her brother. "What do you want?" she asked flatly. Marcus circled the living room like he owned it. He'd done his research, he said. Thorough research. Daniel Carter, warehouse worker, financial problems, No connection to their social circle until suddenly he was Victoria's husband. The timeline was interesting. The lack of history was interesting. The convenient timing was very interesting. He wasn't accusing her of anything directly. Not yet. But he wanted her to know that he knew. And if she insisted on blocking the merger, on questioning his judgment in front of the board, he'd have no choice but to raise concerns about her judgment as well. Victoria's face remained impassive, but Daniel saw her hands clench. This was it. The moment where the careful construct they'd built could collapse. He should have stayed quiet. Should have let Victoria handle it. But he was tired of watching people treat her like a prize to be won or a position to be conquered. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You want to question my marriage to your sister? Go ahead. Investigate all you want. You'll find exactly what we've told people. I'm not from your world. I work for a living. I have a daughter I'm raising alone. Victoria saw something in me worth knowing, and I saw the same in her. You can make that sound suspicious because it doesn't fit your narrative, but the only person here acting like they have something to hide is you. Marcus smiled coldly. Such passion, he said. Almost convincing. But passion wasn't proof. And when the board demanded proof, when they wanted background on this sudden marriage, what would Victoria provide? She could stonewall, sure, but that would only make them more suspicious. Corporate leaders lived in glass houses. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Daniel felt the trap closing. Marcus wasn't wrong. Scrutiny would unravel everything. But Victoria surprised them both. Fine, she said quietly. Call a board meeting. Ask your questions. Demand whatever proof you think you need. But know this, when you go after my personal life, you're admitting you can't beat me on the merits. You're admitting that the only way to undermine me is to attack my character, not my competence. The board will see that. They'll see desperation, not legitimate concern. It was a calculated risk. Calling Marcus's bluff meant exposing themselves to exactly the scrutiny they'd been avoiding. But it also framed any investigation as a personal vendetta rather than corporate due diligence. Marcus hesitated, perhaps not expecting his sister to dare him to follow through. He left without another word, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. This is where everything gets tested. If you've stayed this long, if this story is speaking to something in you, subscribe. Not for me. For the stories that remind us why integrity matters. The next 3 weeks were tense. Daniel and Victoria prepared for the worst. They rehearsed their story until it was airtight. Gathered documentation that would withstand questioning. But mostly they waited. Marcus had gone quiet, which somehow felt more ominous than his threats. Then came the emergency board meeting. Mandatory attendance. No agenda provided. Daniel knew without being told that this was it. He dressed carefully that morning, aware that he was walking into a situation designed to tear him apart. Victoria was already in the living room, reviewing notes, her face a mask of professional calm. Emma hugged them both goodbye, sensing tension even if she didn't understand its source. In the car, Victoria finally spoke. Whatever happens in there, she said, it's not your fault. She'd made this arrangement. She'd set the terms. If it fell apart, the responsibility was hers. But Daniel disagreed. He'd signed the contract. He'd taken the money. He'd benefited from the arrangement just as much as she had. They were in this together, whether that was part of the original plan or not. The boardroom felt different this time. More people. More tension. Marcus sat at the far end of the table, confident and composed. Several board members looked uncomfortable, like they'd been forced into a situation they didn't enjoy. Victoria took her seat, Daniel beside her. The chairman called the meeting to order and turned the floor over to Marcus. Marcus presented his case methodically. He'd hired a private investigator, found inconsistencies in the timeline of Victoria's relationship, discovered Daniel's financial troubles in detail, raised questions about whether this marriage was genuine or merely a convenience designed to satisfy their father's will. He stopped short of explicit accusations, but the implication was clear. Victoria had manufactured a marriage to secure her inheritance. She'd lied to the board. She'd compromised her integrity for power. The room was silent when he finished. All eyes turned to Victoria. Daniel felt his heart pounding, wondering how she could possibly answer allegations that were completely true. But Victoria didn't flinch. She stood, her voice steady, and told them the truth. Not the whole truth, but enough of it to matter. Yes, she said. Her marriage had been sudden. Yes, Daniel had needed financial stability and she'd provided it. But that didn't make their relationship false. It made it unconventional. Her father's will had put her in an impossible position. Find a partner within 6 months or lose everything she'd worked for. So she'd done what she always did. Identified the problem and found a solution. She'd chosen someone genuine. Someone who understood responsibility and sacrifice. Someone who treated her like a person instead of a position. Was it romantic? No. Was it perfect? No. But it was real in the ways that mattered. Daniel had integrated into her life. Built a relationship with her that wasn't based on corporate ambition or social climbing. Helped her remember that success meant nothing if you lost yourself achieving it. If the board wanted to punish her for finding stability in an unconventional way, for being honest about the complications of her situation, then she'd accept that judgment. But she wouldn't apologize for choosing a path that honored both her father's wishes and her own integrity. The room processed this in silence. Then, unexpectedly, one of the older board members spoke. A woman who'd worked with Victoria's father for decades. She asked Daniel directly, "Did he love Victoria?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. This was the moment. He could lie, could say what was expected, could maintain the performance that had carried them this far. Or he could tell the truth even if it destroyed everything. Daniel looked at Victoria, saw her sitting there with her spine straight and her mask firmly in place, waiting for him to betray her or save her. And he realized the answer wasn't simple. Did he love her the way love was supposed to work, sudden and overwhelming and certain? No. But did he care about her, respect her, want her to succeed and be happy? Yes, absolutely, without question. So he answered honestly. "I don't know if what I feel is love," he said. "But I know I respect her more than anyone I've ever met. I know she's a better leader than this room gives her credit for. I know she treats my daughter with more kindness than she had to. And I know that choosing to stand beside her, unconventional arrangement or not, is the best decision I've made since my wife died. If that's not enough for you, then I can't help you. But don't question her integrity because you don't understand how we got here." Another silence. Then Marcus played his final card. He had proof, he said. Bank records showing the payment Victoria made to Daniel. Email correspondence between them discussing terms. The contract itself somehow obtained through means he wouldn't specify. Physical evidence of the transaction that undercut any claim to genuine relationship. He distributed copies around the table, watching Victoria's face for reaction. But before anyone could speak, the door to the boardroom opened. Victoria's attorney entered, followed by someone Daniel didn't recognize. A board member who'd been absent from recent meetings, recuperating from surgery. She took her seat slowly, her expression serious. Marcus's face went pale. The attorney spoke first. Yes, Victoria had paid Daniel. Yes, they'd formalized their arrangement contractually. But Marcus had left out some crucial information in his investigation. Namely, where he'd obtained that contract. The attorney placed another document on the table. Bank records showing payments from Marcus to Victoria's former assistant, the one who'd quit suddenly 3 months ago. Email correspondence showing Marcus had orchestrated the theft of confidential documents from Victoria's home office. Security footage from the building showing his late-night access to restricted areas. Marcus hadn't just investigated his sister. He'd committed corporate espionage, bribed an employee, stolen privileged information, all to undermine Victoria's position. The evidence of his methods was overwhelming. And if they wanted to talk about integrity, about what kind of leader Morrison Industries needed, perhaps they should start with the person who'd violated every ethical standard to satisfy personal ambition. The room erupted. Board members talking over each other. Marcus trying to defend his actions as necessary investigation. The chairman calling for order. But the damage was done. Victoria had been honest about her arrangement, transparent about its complications. Marcus had lied, stolen, and manipulated. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. The vote that followed wasn't about the merger anymore. It was about leadership, about who the board trusted to guide Morrison Industries forward. The result was decisive. Victoria retained her position. Marcus was removed from all company operations pending ethics review. The merger proposal was killed, and Daniel sat there, stunned, realizing they'd won not by maintaining the illusion but by abandoning it. Afterward, in Victoria's office, she finally allowed herself to react. She sat behind her desk, her hands shaking slightly. They'd survived. Barely. The truth was out, which meant the contract was effectively void. There was no need to maintain the arrangement anymore. The 6 months weren't even complete, but the original purpose had been achieved. She was secure in her position. The threat had been neutralized. Daniel knew what came next. They'd separate. He'd take his payment and move out. Emma would go back to their apartment, which he could now afford to keep. They'd return to their separate lives, strangers who'd shared an unusual chapter and closed the book. It was the logical conclusion, the clean ending to a transactional arrangement. But Victoria didn't say any of that. She asked him to stay for dinner, just tonight, to decompress, to let the adrenaline fade before making decisions. He agreed, even though he knew it was probably a mistake. Prolonging the inevitable only made it harder. That evening was strange. They moved around the penthouse like they had for months, familiar and comfortable. Emma did her homework at the dining table. Daniel cooked pasta, nothing fancy. Victoria emerged from her office earlier than usual, drawn by the sounds of normal life. They ate together, Emma chattering about her day, oblivious to the earthquake that had happened in the boardroom. After Emma went to bed, Daniel and Victoria ended up on the balcony again, their usual spot for difficult conversations. He finally asked the question that had been building all evening. What happens now? The contract was blown. Everyone knew the truth. There was no reason for the arrangement to continue. Victoria was quiet for a long time. Then she asked him a question in return. Did he want to leave? Not because of the contract or the money. Not because the performance was over. But actually, genuinely, did he want to take Emma and go back to their old life? Daniel didn't have a simple answer. Logically, they should separate. This had never been meant to be permanent. But Emma was thriving here. She had space and resources and stability. She'd gotten attached to Victoria, looked forward to their chess matches and homework sessions. And if he was being completely honest, so had he. He'd gotten used to Victoria's sharp humor, her rare smiles, the way she softened around Emma, the conversations that happened late at night when both of them should have been sleeping. But wanting to stay and having a reason to stay were different things. The contract had given them structure. Without it, what were they? Victoria seemed to read his thoughts. They could figure it out, she said quietly. If he wanted to. No contract. No performance. Just two people trying to build something real from unusual foundations. It wouldn't be conventional. It wouldn't be easy. But neither of them had chosen conventional paths anyway. Daniel turned to look at her. She was staring out at the city, her profile sharp against the lights. This woman who commanded boardrooms and made corporate sharks back down. This woman who'd been vulnerable enough to admit she needed help, strategic enough to find an unconventional solution, and brave enough to defend it when challenged. This woman who sat on the floor with his daughter to build terrariums and remembered to buy the specific brand of cereal Emma liked. He told her they'd stay, not because of money or necessity, but because leaving felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. Because Emma deserved the stability Victoria could provide. Because he wanted to see where this strange, complicated thing between them might lead if they gave it a chance without deadlines or performance requirements. The kiss happened without planning. Victoria turned toward him at the same moment he moved closer, and suddenly they were breathing the same air. She hesitated, giving him space to back away, but he didn't. He closed the distance, his hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. The kiss was soft, tentative, nothing like the passionate certainty of movie romances. It was a question more than an answer, possibility more than a promise. When they pulled apart, Victoria smiled. Actually smiled. Not the professional expression she wore in public, but something genuine and slightly uncertain. They stood there for a moment longer, letting the city hum below them, letting the weight of the day settle. Then they went inside, back to the life they'd accidentally built together. The months that followed weren't magical or simple. They had to renegotiate everything without the structure of the contract. Had to learn each other without the performance aspect. There were arguments, misunderstandings, moments where the differences in their backgrounds created friction. Victoria worked too much. Daniel sometimes retreated instead of communicating. Emma navigated her evolving relationship with Victoria with the wisdom of children who adapt faster than adults. But they figured it out. Slowly, imperfectly. Victoria started leaving work earlier, not every day but more often. She taught Emma to play piano, revealing unexpected patience. For the discordant notes of a beginner, Daniel learned to accept help without feeling like he was failing, to recognize that partnership meant sharing burdens, not carrying them alone. They created traditions. Friday movie nights, Sunday morning pancakes, evening walks around the neighborhood when the weather was good. Marcus faced consequences for his actions. The board investigation revealed a pattern of ethical violations beyond the stolen contract. He was removed from Morrison Industries entirely, his reputation damaged enough that other companies were wary of hiring him. Victoria didn't celebrate his downfall. She'd never wanted to destroy her brother. She just wanted to be allowed to lead without constant sabotage. The article about Victoria came out 6 months after the Boardroom confrontation. The journalist had captured something true in the photos, moments of genuine connection that transcended performance. The piece praised Victoria's leadership style, her commitment to sustainable growth over aggressive expansion, her ability to balance personal and professional life. It became a reference point for other young executives navigating similar pressures. Daniel never went back to the warehouse. Victoria offered him a position in Morrison Industries, overseeing worker welfare programs and ensuring that the company's growth didn't come at the expense of its employees. It was work that mattered to him, that used his understanding of what life looked like for the people keeping the company running. He was good at it, found satisfaction in advocacy that made tangible differences. Emma flourished. She made friends at her new school, pursued interests she'd never had resources to explore before. But she also stayed grounded, aware of how fortunate she was, cognizant of the struggles other kids faced. Victoria made sure of that, introducing Emma to charity work, teaching her that privilege came with responsibility. 2 years after that first conversation in Victoria's office, Daniel stood in the same boardroom where everything had nearly collapsed. This time he was there as Victoria's partner, officially and genuinely. The board had long since accepted their unconventional origin story. Some members thought it was romantic, this idea of two people finding each other through necessity and building something real. Others just cared that Victoria was an excellent CEO and Daniel's welfare programs had improved retention and productivity. Victoria was presenting a 5-year strategic plan, her vision for Morrison Industries' future. Daniel watched her command the room, confident and capable, no longer fighting for every inch of respect. She'd proven herself beyond any doubt. But afterward, when the meeting ended and board members filtered out, she came to stand beside him at the window. Emma was waiting downstairs with Margaret, who still worked for them and had become something like family. Victoria took his hand, her grip warm and solid. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying, for taking a chance on something that made no sense, for seeing past what this looked like to what it could be." Daniel squeezed back. No words necessary. They'd built something neither of them planned for, something that started as transaction and became foundation. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. And real, complicated, hard-won love was worth more than any fantasy. They went home together, back to the penthouse that had stopped feeling like Victoria's space and become theirs. Emma ran to greet them, full of stories about her day. They sat down to dinner as a family, not a performance or an arrangement but the genuine article. And later, After Emma was asleep and the city stretched out below them like a promise, Daniel and Victoria stood on the balcony again. Their spot, where difficult conversations happened and new beginnings took shape. The rule that changed everything hadn't been about living together or maintaining appearances. It had been the unspoken one, the one neither of them acknowledged until it was too late to resist. Allow yourself to care, to see beyond the transaction, to recognize that sometimes the most unexpected connections become the most essential. That rule had rewritten both their lives, and neither of them regretted it for a moment.